So in RRC setup, we are studying for SA mode first of all. So in RRC setup, there is something called SP cell config dedicated part. Okay, in that we have one thing called initial DL BWP. Initial DL BWP. Okay, this contains a few things called BWP dedicated configuration. This part contains, and this is very important, this part contains no BWP ID. It does not contain any BWP ID. We'll see why. Because it is by default 0. BWP ID is 0. Okay. It only has BWP dedicated part and BWP ID is not present. It does not have a common generic configuration of BWP. BWP have two types of configuration, dedicated and some generic configuration. It does not contain generic because that part is already available in SIB1, through SIB1. Okay. So during cell selection procedure, when you read SIB1, it already has some idea about initial. It's a special kind of bandwidth part. It's called initial bandwidth part, and when you starts reading SIB and MIB etc. UE without knowing is already working in initial downlink bandwidth part. The ID is by default 0, and once you get RRC setup, it gets the dedicated config. This dedicated config basically contains config for all the channels for that, like PD SCH config or PDCCH config etc or SPS config etc. All these things are a part of BWP dedicated. So basically the thing is that if you were to operate between initial DL BWP, it will apply these configurations for these channels or these procedures etc. Okay. Second is second important part of SP cell config dedicated with respect to bandwidth parts is add mod list, BWP list. Basically you can say add mod list or list. So through these lists we can configure up to 4 BWPs. Now each of them will contain a BWP ID. Here ID was not present because ID is by default 0. This will contain a BWP ID. Also, this will contain dedicated as well as common configuration, because the common configuration for these was not present in SIB1. Okay, so this is supposed to have, this needs to have all the configuration. And after that we have another important one called first active BWP ID. Okay, so this does not contain any configuration. This only contains one ID. Similarly, default DL BWP ID. This is also an ID. Okay. So this becomes important when a timer comes into picture called BWP inactivity timer. Okay, so from here we see 3 different type of DL BWPs: initial BWP, first active BWP, and default BWP. So let's study a little bit about them. So initial BWP is a default BWP. When you start searching SSBs present in there, and then SIP1 UE reads from here, etc., etc. So this is initial BWP. BWP ID is 0. Common configuration such as what's the bandwidth of it and where it's located, all of that comes in SIP1, and dedicated BWP configuration comes here in RRC setup. Second one is first active BWP ID. First active BWP. So first active BWP is the BWP that is activated for you for the first time, and it happens through RRC reconfiguration basically, or basically in RRC setup we indicate that till now you are working in 0 and you will keep working in this particular BWP until RRC reconfiguration. But once you read RRC configuration, use this BWP IDs. Now this BWP ID can point here or to any one of these. So this indicates that after RRC config, you have to use this BWP ID. Go here or here, find your BWP ID. If it's 0, it's this one. If it's something else, it must be here. And use that configuration and use that bandwidth part for your further operations. And then there is a default DL-BWP ID. Now this is based on BWP inactivity timer. So UE is working on its own dedicated BWP. Okay. And then suddenly inactivity starts happening. There is no activity happening. There is no transmission happening, or there is no reception happening. When such a thing happens, in that case, if this timer expires, then UE will switch to one of these BWPs which has ID same as this one. So here we are providing the ID of the BWP which UE has to shift to if this timer expires. This also again can point here or can point to one of these. So these are the different type of BWPs. So initial DL BWP is the one that is a initial BWP. Initially when you start the cell search procedure or registration, everything happens in here, and then there can go to these options, and then UE will use the BWP with this ID once reconfiguration is complete. And if at any point of time BWP inactivity timer expires in a particular, when UE was working in a particular BWP dedicated to it, then UE will move to one of these DL BWPs, ID of which is provided here. Okay, let's say the ID of this is of course 0, ID of this is, let's say 3, this is 7, this is 9, and this is 5. So if I say first active is 5 and default is 9, so what UE will do, UE will perform registration here, but once RRC reconfiguration is done, UE will switch to this bandwidth part and will start working here. And if let's say inactivity happens and timer expires, UE will start monitoring this downlink BWP ID, this one. Otherwise it was working in this one. Okay, then UL. So there is after SPCell config, in SPCell config there is something called UL config also, and in UL config we have again initial UL BWP, and there is a add mod list again to configure up to 4, 0, 1, 2 and 3, and there is first active, and there is first active UL BWP. Add mod list could be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then there is first active key ID. First active UL BWP ID. So it's on the same lines. Initially it does not carry an ID, only contains dedicated stuff, PUSCH, TUCCH, etc. config. Add mod list provides another 4 similar lines, and first active becomes active after RRC reconfig. It does not have a concept of default UL BWP ID, because if there is an inactivity, then UE does not need to send anything in uplink. It only needs to monitor downlink. Okay, If UE is inactive, it may need to monitor paging in downlink only. In uplink, it does not need to do that. So there is no concept of default UL BWP ID. There is none. Only in downlink we have a default DL BWP ID concept. So this is all about the types that we have of BWP, bandwidth parts. Quite a very important topic, quite a very interesting topic. I would say that. I find it interesting. And